No refrigerator, no electric light, no hot water from a tap for one whole weekend. This house ran on nothing but 1926 rules. Icebox, washboard, wood stove, the works. Some of it shocked me by how well it worked. One ritual became the hardest thing I have ever done in my own kitchen, and two of the old methods are never leaving this house again. My wife and I set out to answer a question that had been gnawing at me for years. If the grid went down tomorrow, or if we simply got sick of the mounting bills, could we actually live like our great-grandparents did? The answer turned out to be both humbling and surprisingly hopeful. But the one thing we never prepared for was the butter. The rules were simple. From Friday sundown to Sunday sundown. Nothing that required a plug, a battery, or a combustion engine built after 1926. No refrigerator. No stove with a pilot light. No car. We drew our water from a hand pump in the yard. We lit the house with kerosene lamps and candles. And every meal had to come from ingredients that a farm wife in 1926 would have had in her pantry. The promise I made to myself was honest documentation. No cheating when the camera wasn't rolling. If something broke us, I would say so. If something turned out to be easier than we expected, I would say that too. The first 12 hours felt like a novelty. The silence, the slow flicker of flame, the sound of a cast-iron skillet heating on a wood stove that had sat cold in our kitchen for 5 years. My wife, Sarah, took to it faster than I did. She had read a dozen books on historical housekeeping before we started. She knew the difference between a sad iron and a flat iron. She understood that a cookstove firebox needs to be hot enough to turn the cast iron cherry red before you can bake properly. I thought I knew what hard work meant. Then I tried to make butter. We had raw cream from a local dairy, a glass churn with a wooden paddle, and the blind confidence of people who have watched too many period dramas. How hard could it be? I churned for 20 minutes. Nothing. 30 minutes. Still liquid. 45 minutes in. My arms were burning. My shoulders ached. And the cream looked exactly the same as when I started. Sarah took over. She churned with a steady rhythm I absolutely did not have. 55 minutes. An hour. And then, finally, a small yellow fleck appeared. It took another 20 minutes before those flecks gathered into a solid mass of pale butter, floating in thin buttermilk. 1 hour and 15 minutes for less than a pound of butter, and I suddenly understood why my great-grandmother kept a spring house with a cold stream running through it and never romanticized farm life. That butter was the best thing I have ever tasted, not because it was superior to store butter. Objectively, it was gritty because I failed to wash it properly and salt it evenly. It was the best because I had earned it in a way I had never earned anything from a grocery store shelf. That became the pattern of the entire weekend. Some things were brutal. Washing clothes by hand on a scrub board made me want to die. I spent 2 hours on 3 shirts, 2 pairs of pants, and some undergarments, and my knuckles were raw when I was done, and the clothes smelled fine, but they felt stiff and line-dried and abrasive. Sarah later told me that was partly due to soap residue, and partly because modern detergent is a miracle of chemical engineering. In 1926, they would have used homemade lye soap, bluing, and a whole lot of elbow grease. I just used the same soap we had in the bathroom, and a lack of technique. I will never take a washing machine for granted again. But then, there was the icebox. We have an original one, a hardwood cabinet with a galvanized interior, and a block of ice delivered from a local ice house that still cuts from a lake in winter. We bought a 25-pound block. It lasted the entire weekend. Not just lasted, it kept our milk colder than my modern refrigerator does on its lowest setting. The butter we made, the cream, the eggs, everything held, and never once approached unsafe temperatures. And the icebox made no noise, no compressor hum, no fan clicking on and off in the middle of the night. I have been conditioned my whole life to ignore the constant electric whine of the kitchen. When it was gone, I heard the difference. My sleep improved on the first night. Now, the wood stove. That was the revelation that reframed everything. We lit it Friday evening. A small fire of split oak and kindling. Once the firebox reached the right temperature, the entire cast iron cooktop became a functional kitchen. We fried bacon in the morning. We boiled a kettle for coffee. We simmered a stew all afternoon with a pot that never burned on the bottom because the heat diffused so evenly, and the stove heated the house. The kitchen stayed warm all night, and the residual heat in the iron mass meant I could light a new fire the next morning with barely any effort. But here is the thing I did not expect. The wood stove made me a better cook, because I could not just twist a knob and walk away. I had to watch the fire, feel the temperature with my hand over the griddle, add an extra stick when the flames died down, open a damper when the pot needed a hard boil. It forced me to be present in a way I have never been in a modern kitchen, and the food tasted different. It tasted like care. Saturday night, we had roasted chicken with root vegetables. The skin crackled, the carrots caramelized. I have a modern range that cost $3,000, and I have never gotten that result. But the moment that stopped me cold was the lamp, not the lamp itself. A kerosene lamp is simple. A wick, a glass chimney, a bright amber flame that casts deep shadows. What stopped me was how much more I could see after the sun went down. Not with my eyes, with my mind. By 8 o'clock, with no screens, no entertainment to flick on, no light brighter than a candle, my brain did something it had not done since I was a child. It got quiet. And in that quiet, Sarah and I talked. Not about bills or schedules or what needed doing. We talked about the day, about the coffee, about how the butter was worth the wait. We played a game of cribbage with a board my father left me. We read a chapter of a book out loud by the lamp, and I realized this was the rhythm my ancestors knew, the rhythm that had been stolen by the flick of a switch. This was not hardship. This was living at the pace of a candle flame, and I had never felt less exhausted. Then Sunday morning came, and with it, the hardest lesson of the entire weekend. Sunday morning. I woke up before sunrise, threw a log into the firebox, and waited for the coffee water to boil. That was when I noticed the ice. The block we had bought on Friday was now a sliver, barely bigger than my hand, and the milk jug, which had been so perfectly cold all weekend, now felt merely cool. The icebox had worked exactly as designed, but its design required a new block every 2 or 3 days in summer, and that meant an ice delivery, a service that vanished from most American towns before 1950. Without it, the icebox was just a wooden cabinet. This was the first crack in the fantasy. A farm wife in 1926 was not a self-sufficient island. She had a milkman who came every morning, an iceman who came twice a week, a butcher who slaughtered and delivered, a baker if she did not bake her own bread every single day. She lived in a network of tradesmen and neighbors that made the whole system function. Remove the network and the house collapses. I had spent the entire weekend feeling proud of my grit. Now I realized I was playing a game with cheat codes. A hand pump that someone else had drilled, a block of ice that someone else had cut from a lake, cream from a dairy that someone else had milked. Real self-sufficiency in 1926 was a community project, not an individual achievement, and that is when the hardest lesson hit. It was not the physical labor, not the butter, not the washboard, not the constant splitting of kindling. It was the mental absence this life demanded. In a modern house, I can ignore the systems that keep me alive. I turn a tap and water appears. I open the fridge and food is cold. I set a thermostat and forget the furnace. On a 1926 homestead, every single comfort required active attention. The fire needed feeding every few hours. The lamp needed its wick trimmed, its chimney cleaned of soot. The icebox needed monitoring. The water pump needed priming if it sat too long. Nothing could be set and forgotten. My mind, which had felt so peaceful and quiet on Saturday night, was by Sunday afternoon a running tally of small impending failures. Is there enough wood for the oven to finish the bread? Did I cover the milk? Is the kerosene canister full? Did I trip over the dog when I came in from the yard because the house is too dim to see my feet? And this was in fair weather, in a house that was not our only source of survival. If a cow had needed milking before dawn, if a crop had been wilting in a dry spell, if a child had been sick with a fever, the margin would have vanished completely. I understood, for the first time in my life, why the old-timers looked serious in photographs. They were not unhappy. They were just never off the clock. The house itself was the job. The house never clocked out, and neither did they. But here is the thing that surprised me most. By the time Sunday afternoon came, I did not want to stop. The weekend was ending. The electric lights would come back on. The refrigerator would hum. The washing machine would erase hours of labor in 40 minutes. And I felt genuine grief, not for the hard parts, for the good parts, for the silence, for the single flame that drew my wife and I to the same table, for the food that tasted like it, had a story, for the sleep that came without a screen in front of my face. I wanted to keep the quiet. I wanted to keep the fire. I just did not want to keep the exhaustion. And that is exactly what we did. When the sun set on Sunday evening, Sarah looked at me across the lamp and said, "We are keeping the icebox, aren't we?" She was right, but we also kept something else, something I did not expect, and it has nothing to do with antiques. The first thing we kept was obvious. The icebox now lives permanently in our kitchen corner. We swapped the electric refrigerator to the basement for bulk storage, and day to day the icebox handles milk, butter, eggs, and the evening's vegetables. The ice block costs less than the electricity the old fridge burned. But that was not the real victory. The real victory was the stove. The same wood stove that had sat cold for 5 years is now the heart of our home. Not for emergencies, not for novelty. It is our primary cooker, from October through March. The stews are deeper. The bread has a crust that an electric oven cannot reproduce, and the heat that rises from the iron mass warms the house in a way that forced air never could. It warms the bones instead of just moving air around. But the stove did something else I never anticipated. It reordered our day. I now split kindling in the morning as a ritual, not a chore. Sarah checks the firebox before bed with the same instinct she uses to lock the front door. We have become stewards of a fire that we feed and tend, and in return, it feeds and warms us. That reciprocity has changed how I think about every other machine in my life. And then there was the third thing, the one that has nothing to do with antiques. Sunday night, when the experiment ended, we flipped the main breaker back on. The lights came up. The refrigerator hummed. The smart speaker chimed. And then Sarah reached over and shut them all off again. She lit a candle and placed it on the table, and we sat there for another hour in the quiet, talking about what it would take to do this again next weekend. Not the full 1926 deprivation, just the parts that made us better. The silence, the fire, the single flame. We realized we could keep the quiet without the hardship. So now, every evening after 7, the screens go dark. The lamps get lit, and we live by candlelight, not because we have to, but because we learned that the most valuable thing we lost in the last 100 years was not convenience. It was the space between the tasks, the margin where a marriage lives, and that costs nothing to reclaim. We didn't need to surrender our modern life to get that margin back. We just needed to stop letting the noise dictate when the day was over. The 1926 weekend was never really about the past. It was about figuring out which parts of progress actually cost us something precious, and which parts we can quietly, deliberately set aside. If you've ever felt that low hum of modern life is a little too loud, try one evening without it. Light a candle. Sit with someone you love. Ask them about their day, not their to-do list. I want to hear from you. If you could bring back one thing from the way people lived 100 years ago, what would it be? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and your answers shape what we do next. Hit subscribe. Tap the bell, because we're going deeper into these experiments. And if this made sense to you, there's a special offer through the link in the first pinned comment. I put it together for folks who are ready to bring some of this quiet into their own home. Thank you for watching. Now, go reclaim your evening.